International Film Festival and is presently the Asian programmer for the Real World Film Festival. And what are you going to be talking about, Alan? Oh, you're going to be talking about the movie Better Luck Tomorrow. Did everybody see that film? Pretty interesting. I'd like to really hear about your take on that, the significance in North America and the Asian Canadian, and he'll be talking to us about the Asian Canadian Artists Fund. Next to him is Nicholas Cohn, whom I met initially as a reporter at CCNCTO Daily, a Chinese language newspaper. I think the first Chinese language daily after the Xinhua, which was sort of like the personal diatribe piece of one of local citizens. But it was the first sort of professional newspaper that came into the city. And he now works for Toronto Star initially as a general assignment reporter 8 years ago, and he's now the immigration and diversity reporter. And he writes about the challenges facing newcomers to the policies and our environment. And he'll be talking about Asian representation in the news media. Beside Nicholas is Min Suk, also another person that I have met. I'm dropping names, you see. She's a documentary filmmaker and activist living in Toronto. Her last documentary was El Contrato, looking at the lives of migrant Mexican farm workers who come to Canada to work in the greenhouses. She's working on a documentary about the politics of policing. I should like to see what that's going to be like. It's going to be released in 2005. She has a media background and worked as writer and producer. You would have seen her on air most recently at Toronto 1, and before that CBC Newsreel, on radio, etc. She had made a lot of links with Cecilia Chung during that time, but I don't know if that's the focus she's going to cover. It'd be really interesting to see and hear from her how the media treats certain issues dealing with the community and how that affects us here. And last but not least, I've done this before. Calling one of my best friends, least but not last. Sally Lee is Executive Director of the Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival, and she has been in that position since 2002. Before that, she was Membership Coordinator at the Liaison of Independent Filmmakers of Toronto, and she's worked as cast and crew on productions. And she's sat on juries for the Arts Council. She's worked on the Sprockets Film Festival, which my nieces enjoy. And she's currently on the committee for Dim Sum, which is going to be a festival of contemporary Chinese culture scheduled to take place at Harbourfront in 2005. And she'll be talking about the Real Asian Film Fest and its significance to actors and producers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panel for tonight. The first speaker will be Richard Lee. Do you want to stand?
Sure. So you didn't ask me to stand. I'm just going to kind of kneel, sit, stand here. Okay, so I'm talking mainly from the perspective of an actor, mainly from my experiences as an Asian artist in film and theater. I mean, the current state of film and theater, which I've experienced so far, is that we are exposed largely to, in terms of those mainstream companies, we are exposed to these stereotypical roles of like delivery boy or these minor characters of, doctor number 1, family doctor number 2, gangster number 3, sidekick number 1, and all these roles that, I mean, you can just turn on a TV and you can see for yourself where most of these Asians lie in. Has it changed over the past 20 years in terms of Susan's question? Yes, I think it has. I think that more often, many producers are starting to have a bit more of an open mind towards seeing diverse talent. Is it changing fast? No, probably not. And that's a bit of a shame, but I think that those excuses that they keep giving us as to the reasons why, saying that there's no talent out there, saying that Asian stories aren't interesting, that that the larger audiences aren't interested in that, that's something that we as artists, or we as the people sitting up here, we as the people who produce these works need to change. Okay, so that being said, in terms of the types of roles that are available, Barnett wanted me to talk about, the question of, why is it that Asian females especially in film, are always seen as those sexy, sidekicks, or like these sexy vixens of women or best friend roles. And why are there not more Asian female leads? Why are there not more stories where you have two Asians in the screen in a love story? Or why can't there be a cross-cultural thing? And why Asian males are often seen as martial artists or gangsters, and why we can't get beyond that kind of stereotype. And I think that personally, in terms of a mainstream audience, film and TV, they're trying to appeal to a mass audience. For them, it's the bottom line of trying to make that dollar. What sells the most. And it's not to say that they won't take risks. They do, and sometimes, not very well. The most recent thing that I say they, but the most recent, I guess, mainstream film that most of you would have seen would have been Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle, which was a very interesting film, and in many ways was very much a breakthrough for Asians, especially Asian males, who have most often not been seen in a light where they've been romantic leads, or that they can carry a story, or that they're interesting enough to watch. And I think that movies like that are, yes, very important, but also, more importantly, what those movies are about are equally as important. I mean, for me, watching that movie, Harold and Kumar, was a great, enjoyable, fun film to watch, but it was kind of like, Van Wilder, or, any one of those teen kind of jock comedies, which is not to say that it was bad, but it was also, it was also like, yeah, that's kind of interesting, and that's, had that opened with two white leads in it, I'm sure it would have done the same in terms of its box office intake, in terms of its interest. Is that to say that it failed? No, I think that really it succeeded in many ways. In the producer's eyes, I'm sure they would have wished for it to have been number one, number two, because they're banking on the fact that there's an Asian market out there, that they're going to pander to that, and for them they were like, well, if there's such demand for it, why? If there's such a demand for it, and that's the reason why we're putting in the money, where are the audiences? And for me, I think that watching that movie, I was like, well, that was a great film, but it wasn't also something that I would have 100% been, yeah, that blew my mind away as such. I'm skipping topics here, sorry. Okay, so I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit to this topic of cultural appropriation. And Barnett was talking, and he was asking me about things like, how do I feel about cultural appropriation in things like Kill Bill and The Matrix. And cultural appropriation for me is, the way I define it, is that, I mean, it's like taking the story of, say for example, The Monkey King, right? Very Chinese tale, and casting 5 Caucasian people in that. And that for me is where I see cultural appropriation, that it's an Asian story that in its roots, in what it says, in its tales and its morals, and even in the culture that it's from, it's an Asian tale. So why would you go and cast 5 Caucasian males or 5 Caucasians in those roles? And in terms of The Matrix, and in terms of Kill Bill, that for me is not necessarily cultural appropriation, not because the aspects that they're using aren't Asian, but because here's a story of a Caucasian woman who goes through these ordeals, which aspects of them are Asian, which she learns Kung Fu from a Kung Fu master, and which she uses martial arts in order to achieve her goals. But it's not the story of an Asian who's going through this, it's a story of a Caucasian woman. So in that sense, I didn't see it as cultural appropriation. More importantly, though, I think what I'd like to talk about is thank you. More importantly, I'd like to talk about what Asian artists, or what people in general, can do in order to change these things. And I think that the most important thing for me is that we're going out there and we're creating work, and we're creating work that's not like just we're Asians, so therefore you should come see my show and support me, but because that, and also because we're creating work that's interesting to watch, that any story that we come up with, whether it be film, theater, dance, or visual arts, etc., that we are all there and we're creating interesting art. It's not just Asian art, that it's something that everyone can enjoy. And in that sense, that we keep producing works, and that we keep working and not, you know, be at the mercy of sitting around waiting for roles to come, or, you know, going, I'm just gonna be content auditioning for people and being an actor in things, you know, being active and going, what story or what thing can I create in order for people to watch, in order for people to enjoy, and in essence taking away those excuses. Well, the Asians, we don't see Asians as role models, so we can't see them as presidents of a state, because there are no Asians who are presidents of the state in America. You know, why is that? Why not? Because, you know, a bigger topic, but, you know, we as those artists telling these stories, we feed the imagination of the youth of tomorrow in that sense, right? You know, why can't we dream of being the Prime Minister of Canada one day? We can. Sorry, where am I going? Okay, back to the topic. Just saying that, you know, and what can you do? Really just, for me, the thing that I keep doing is that I just keep working and telling my story, and saying that it's my story, that, and honoring also too the stories that were told in the past, right? My parents' story, the story of their immigration to Canada, the story of my history from Hong Kong, you know. But I'm also, you know, telling the story of me here and now, and saying, you know, these are my these are my issues. These are my experiences here and now in this moment. And I think I'm at 10 minutes.
No, you've got a 1 minute credit, so we'll give that back to you later.
I'll segue into Alan then. Okay. And going back to things that are really interesting, going back to the issue of breakthrough stories. I mean, Better Luck Tomorrow was a great example of Asians, you know, being Asians and portraying their particular in the light they want to see, as opposed to, you know, here's a story of Asian guys and their guys, or their Asian guys and going through their own journey. Anyway, so that segues into Alan's. Here you go.
Thanks, Richard. Sorry, I'm going to sit. Can I have a show of hands? How many people watched Better Luck Tomorrow? Either in the theater or on DVD, video, TV, whatever. That's not bad. I was hoping for more. 30%? 30%? Okay. For those who haven't seen it, Better Luck Tomorrow was an American film that came out last year in the spring, around the time of the Iraq invasion. And it was a film made by a Los Angeles Chinese-American filmmaker named Justin Lin. And he made it for next to nothing. He pulled in a lot of favors. He managed to get very cheap film stock. His actors donated their time, more or less. The crew donated their time. The film was made for about $250,000 American, approximately, and it grossed $5 million US. Add to that, subtract from that actually, about another $1 million in print and advertising. So the bottom line is the film made a decent profit. It wasn't a huge blockbuster, but considering the scale of the film, which is small, independent film, it did remarkably well, and it showed up on a number of top 10 lists around the country, around America and Canada. The significance of Better Luck Tomorrow, and just for those of you who haven't seen the film, it's about four high school kids, and they all happen to be Asian, and they're bad boys. And so you see them commit crimes, they go to Vegas, they have a good time, they get a hooker. In other words, they do all the things that you would expect and that you would see from white characters. But this time it was applied to Asian faces. And the significance of the film is that, A, it broke stereotypes, especially for Asian males. Asian males were seen as, you know, not bookworms, not Harvard graduate types, not nerds. They were seen as sexual animals. They were seen as sinful creatures. In other words, they were seen as human beings with all their flaws and with all their virtues. That is a breakthrough for Asian American cinema and Asian Canadian cinema, because those characters are rarely represented on screen. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? I'm more concerned with how Justin got that film made. I was lucky enough to talk with him about it depth. And he had some obstacles in terms of marketing the film. And the film was picked up by MTV Films as one of their first movies, and I think it was picked up by Paramount, if I'm not mistaken, one of the big studios. And the film was shown at Sundance, and you probably heard the story. At Sundance, a white gentleman, after one of the screenings, stood up and said, "How dare you show us a film that portrays such negative stereotypes of your people?" And the cast and crew, they defended that, but they were beaten by a film critic from Chicago named Roger Ebert, who stood up and replied, "Well, these guys have every right to make a film portraying their people in the manner that they wish. You know, it's none of your damn business." And you got to credit Roger Ebert for validating the film and giving it that instant cachet. But just going back to Better Luck Tomorrow and how it got marketed, at one of the early marketing meetings with the studio, Justin was shown a big pie graph, and the pie graph was sliced up according to racial groups. And Justin asked, "Well, where are the Asians?" And he was told, "Well, Asians from our studies, they have spending habits like white people, so we absorb them into that slice of the pie graph." And Justin just shook his head and went, "No. You recognize Asians for what they are." And Justin put his money where his mouth was, and he and his team did a grassroots marketing campaign to the campuses across America. They focused especially on Asian students because they knew that that was one of their core audiences. Their other core audience was the under 25, 16 to 25. So the film is a breakthrough because of what it portrayed on screen, but it's a breakthrough also because of the way it sold the film to its audience. And I think therein lies the key to any Asian, Canadian, or Asian American artist, is that you have to play businessman, and that is a dirty word for a lot of artists. But unfortunately, we live in the reality where, especially in film, and I don't profess to knowing a lot about other arts like theater, I know film. Film is a very expensive canvas, and if you want to get your film made, you got to have some money. But if you want to get it shown, you got to have some money as well, and a lot of smart, dedicated people who will just fight for your film. So I think the lesson here would be, Asian artists do have to learn how to market, but at the same time, I think non-artistic Asians should help their brothers and sisters who are artists. It doesn't matter if you can, take a photograph or act or write or direct. If you have an interest, if you have a passion in having your people portrayed on screen or on stage, then do something about it. First of all, attend the movies, attend the plays, but if you have, say, expertise in publicity, why not lend that? If you know how to market, why not help, the filmmaker or the theater director or whoever? Asians are one of the most wealthiest ethnic groups in Canada. Every demographic study shows that. We're also one of the largest and rapidly growing. All those demographics are out there. The Canadian census says 1 out of 10 Canadians is Asian, and that number will double within our lifetimes. It's only a matter of time before we see more Asians on screen, but I don't take that for granted because we're already behind. Why aren't there more faces on the screens of Canada, and especially America? Which briefly brings me to ACAF, Asian Canadian Artists Fund, which was founded by myself and a gentleman named Randy Sheck. Both filmmakers, we both have an interest in the film community, and we wanted to give a hand to Asian artists in Ontario. So NAP Toronto stands for North American Association of Asian Professionals. It's a networking group for Asian professionals, but they welcome anybody. And one of their big mandates is to promote, to level the playing field in terms of representation in any industry, whether it's banking or theater. And so they helped us organize the fund, and we had an assist from a number of people. around town. And we raised $10,000, gave away, I wish it was 10 million. I gave away 3 grants, one in visual arts, one in theater, and one of the recipients is here, Kira Lobren. There she is. And the filmmaker they gave the money to was Romeo Candido, whose feature film, Lolo's Child, actually opened the Toronto Real Asian Film Festival a few years ago. So NAP was proud to do that. Is there going to be a fund next year? That is really up to NAP. I'm sort of out of the day-to-day, but they're in discussions about it right now. Sorry.
Okay, got a minute.
A minute? Okay.
Make it count. You can hold it for later if you like.
Yeah, I might.
Okay.
I'm just not sure. So I think I'll just continue later and just pass the mic on right now. I guess what I want to say is that I don't think Asian artists can do it alone. They really need the help of the business community to serve as an audience, to pay your money, go to see the movies and the plays, but also to help in the building of these movies. Personally, I would like to see more Asians, instead of Asians going into the boardrooms of film companies and TV companies and making those green light decisions for Asian filmmakers. That's what people don't talk about enough. You can't just leave it on the artists who are holding down a day job, lucky to pay their bills and creating their art at night, weekends, whatever. So on that note, I'd like to pass the microphone on.
And when you do, maybe later on when you have a chance to speak again, Alan, you might want to answer the question of how we convince our parents to accept art as a career choice. I mean, translate into Chinese doctor, lawyer, computer scientist. How do you okay.
Just to quickly answer that, I think Asian parents are happy if you're an actor or a painter or whatever. If you're doing well, I think they just want to see you prosper. But that is a big problem. That is a big obstacle, and that is our own cultural bias, which is a shame because Chinese, for example, have given the world so much in writing, philosophy, painting, theater, and film. So why is that discouraged? I don't understand that.
Okay, thank you, Nick.
Hi, good evening. I've been asked to talk about, representation of East Asians and Southeast Asians in the media, especially in the news media. And I'm just curious, how many of you actually feel that, Asians and basically the issues of Asians being misrepresented or underrepresented in the quote-unquote mainstream media? Just show your hands. And I just think, having worked for 3 years at St. Town Daily and also spent another 8 years at the Star, it sort of gives me an insight into why that would happen in the mainstream media. I think, we've come a long way that, in the past, most mainstream media just focus on, the cultural festivals, writing about, all those fluffy stories. But we've come a long way now. We try to focus more on issues to do with community. But I think there's, systemically, there are some barriers to actually for various ethnic communities to access the mainstream media. First of all, that's the issue about accessibility. So often you have to, I guess, like any other business, it's not about what you know, but who you know. Sometimes, when you have, you happen to know an Asian reporter or a black reporter who works at a news agency. Usually, you would have a better chance to get your story into the paper. And I think a lot of ethnic communities, they don't really know how to use the mainstream media, in the sense that they don't know what exactly mainstream media actually looking for that would be newsworthy or considered interesting to their readers. And secondly, about practicality, the Star. I can speak on behalf of other newspapers, but at the Star, we don't really have a focused, targeted audience. It's a big family daily, so we have to have stories that we try to appeal to everyone who picks up the Star, a copy of the Star that day, and I think that's partially in the system. That's why it's hard. For example, maybe 5% of our readers actually are Chinese, another 2% actually Japanese, and how do we actually be everything for everyone? I think that itself could be a challenge, and I'm not giving excuse to the Star, my boss, for the underrepresentation of some of the issues involving different ethnic communities, but I think that's the reality that we have to deal with, because at the end of the day, it's still a business. And but what I think what the Star has been trying to do, instead of just focusing on writing about one community, the Asian community, the Southeast Asian community, we actually try to put issues under the context. An issue that affects the South Asian community may also be an issue for the Black community or for the Latin American community. And what we've been doing more frequently now is to put use those issues to actually connect communities. So, for example, usually it would happen under the umbrella of religious issues, because when we write about issues to do with Muslims, we have Muslims from Africa, from Asia, from Southeast Asia, or we write about issues under the banner of immigration, because there are so many new immigrants who actually would encounter similar issues. So in a way, I think that's actually a better way to cover those issues, because we're not segregating communities into this is the compartment for the Chinese, this is the compartment for people from the Caribbean, and you actually connect people so they see more commonalities or humanities among them than just feeling okay, being excluded or segregated into their own corners. That's the way I look at it. And also, thirdly, there's the issue about diversity and multiculturalism. I think those two terms actually they have been overused in the society in general, especially in Canada. But when you ask someone what exactly does it mean, it's something so vague, so ambiguous, and you can't really pin it down. And going back to my point about covering different ethnic communities under the context of issues, I think that's sort of a way to make it more concrete when you actually try to cover diversity and diversity and multiculturalism. And the second question that I was given by Barnett was about are there obstacles to getting stories about ethnic issues published an editor in Toronto? I have had 4 stories killed in 2 weeks, and I think it's competing for 26 pages in a newspaper every day. It's you sort of hit and miss all the time, but I have to say that sometimes it takes sensitivity from the management to play up those stories to deal with different ethnic communities. When you look at the newsroom or most management still today, you see it's still very Eurocentric. And when you have the management, mostly the people in the management coming from a privileged segment of the society, I don't think they really, have enough knowledge or sensitivity to diversity issues or issues to do with certain, small groups of ethnic communities. Sorry, I hate to use that word, but I do think that stories about Chinese Canadians, actually, they are covered a bit different in the mainstream media from the Chinese media. I think, for the Chinese media, they tend to cover, when I've worked there, when, I was always told to make sure, grab whoever who happens to be Chinese in the audience, or whoever speakers, like, who happen to be Chinese, make sure you grab them and quote them in your story. And I guess, basically the time when Susan was actually sitting on the police services board, we talked a lot because, she was the, I think at the time, you were the only Chinese member on the board. Yeah.
But I wasn't speaking as a Chinese.
Yes, that's very important too. But I think, sort of like for the Chinese media, they sort of like tend to have that slant when in their coverage. And and I think like also another example would be, for example, there's a school board report. The quote-unquote mainstream media would be covering about, the scores, comparing the scores among students from different Board of Education across Greater Toronto. But maybe, for the Chinese media, they would focus more on the ESL, the English as second language, ESL part of the scores. But I think for sure, like, when it comes down to the coverage of, Chinese issues, or to do with any ethnic communities, the ethnic media would definitely, have the advantage of having all the contacts, then who can really represent the community than the mainstream media. Like, so often we are more in the reactive mode than being proactively, like, looking for stories. And how can students reclaim the news? I think the reason, like, I think in the past years, I've noticed for sure that, for example, I think, it all comes down to the fact of like how much political or economic clout each community has. Then they would get, their voice represented in the media. Because, for example, like for the Jewish community, like they are very media savvy, and you see their voices, represented. They have really vocal communities too, like a very vocal community. So you often see their issues, written up, in any media or on TV, and that's happening with the Muslim community after 9/11 as well. They have become really organized. They've had media workshops, to train the members of the community, how to approach the media, how to frame the issues, instead of leaving it up to the media to set the agenda. And I think in order to have your voices represented in the mainstream media, you really have to be media savvy, and you have to know how to use the media. You need to know the context that you could trust and you could use. And make sure you're vocal. Keep writing to the editor's page to have your opinions represented, reflected, and make sure your voice counts. And I think so often the challenge for me, being the immigration diversity reporter at the Star, you as a reporter too, occasionally you would feel marginalized as well, in the sense that what you write about, usually you don't hear any feedback from the readers. Like, I think partially maybe people, they're not really, they don't have a good command of the language. They don't read the Star, even though their issues being written about. And also, I think for a lot of cultures, they don't trust the media. I'm not talking about people like Susan, who's been in Canada like for generations. But
just my own.
but I'm talking about especially the newcomers community. They really need to develop that media savviness. And the last question is about why...
I'm going to hold you there, Nicholas.
Okay.
You can answer it in the response section, and we'll move on to Minister. I'd be interested to hear from you later also as to your reaction and the audience's reaction to the two Toronto papers that I bothered to read. I don't read the National Post. I hope there's nobody here from there. But we don't call the Sun a newspaper. So of the two others, there are two campaigns that the two have done recently. You'll recall that the Star took on racial profiling, and the Globe, and it's still doing it, is doing the China Rising thing. And I really would like to hear your response and reaction to that, positive, negative, and so on. And so,
Thanks, Susan, and thanks to CCNC and all the sponsors for doing this panel. I think it's really important, and I'm really encouraged to see how many people are here and how many people are paying attention to this. I wanted to start with a little bit of history. Almost 3 decades ago, the Urban Alliance on Race Relations was founded. And one of the first projects the Alliance undertook was a study of race and representation in the media. Susan knows this well, because Susan Ng was one of the central players in the work of the Alliance and was involved in getting people together, as she told you in the beginning of our talk. And let me just digress 1 second here before I continue to say what an honor it is to sit here at a panel with Susan, because Susan is a real trailblazer in terms of a woman, an Asian woman who is very vocal in civic politics and in our city. I grew up in a variety store. My parents ran it, and my parents didn't read English, but we'd sell the newspaper every day. And they'd always see Susan's picture in the Toronto Sun or the Star or the Globe. And they were like, Minsa, you've got to grow up and be someone like her, because she's clearly very important. Her picture is everything.
I could have been a serial killer.
But in our topic tonight, I read the headlines, and I was quite young, but I still read them. And I saw that Susan was being vilified and racialized. She was called the Dragon Lady. I remember that headline. Susan was at the time the chair of the Police Services Board, and she took on the chief of police and was trying to hold the police accountable for how they behaved and operated in the city. In particular, went at great pains to make Susan seem like a dragon lady who was alien, who was evil incarnate, and how dare she take on the white WASP police force and challenge their law and order. So I'd like to say that Susan's been through that kind of media representation. Anyways, one of the first projects the Alliance did was a study of race and representation in the pages of the Toronto Sun. They reviewed the editorials, columns, and articles, and not surprisingly, the study found a consistent pattern of racist representation of people of color over a period of 7 years. Racist images, stereotypes, and perspectives. And the pattern was so prevalent that the study concluded that the Toronto Sun had violated the fundamental freedoms and responsibilities that society entrusts to the press. Okay, so that was one study. And fast forward to 2004, how much has changed? This year, the Task Force for Cultural Diversity on Television found that visible minorities were more likely to be associated with arts and entertainment, cultural stuff, accidents and disasters, religious and war-related stories, or contexts like that kind of disaster scenario, in English language news and other information programming. So the same pigeonholing of our news stories continues. And yes, we do see more people of color faces on television. And mostly it's reporters, usually attractive reporters, because TV is that kind of media, right? So you've got that, but the producers, editors, and camera people are still largely white and still largely male, and the kinds of decisions and ownership of the media represents a white male hierarchy. So it does influence how stories are told. And my concern is not just the pigeonholing and stereotyping of our stories, but the kinds of stories and the content that is neutered from our stories. What's disturbing for me is what I see often that happens is the depoliticization of our stories. As though, I think what we all understand is that our lives and our stories in this country are inherently political. We can't escape the kind of racist immigration policies that were manufactured to essentially keep most people of color out of this country. This is a white settler state. It has been colonized from First Nations land. And that's a very recent history. And I think that that kind of reinforcement of the power structures in the media has been generally the status quo. So instead of just having our stories and more people of color faces on media, I'm very interested in making sure that our realities are not whitewashed, because that's what politicization does to our lives. So I'd say in the past 5 decades, there have been countless studies, a lot of stats, and we've all lived it. We know that racist representation in the media does take place. And I'm 35 years old, and I feel really old. Maybe it's not, but I feel old, and I'm kind of tired of pointing out the kind of racist representation in the media, because I've worked in media, in different forms of media, for about 15 years. I started off in community media, CKLN Radio, which was a really amazing breeding ground for building alternative points of views, for fighting for social justice, and for building community networks, and presenting alternative ideas of who we are, and showing what is possible, and things that are imaginable, and breaking fantasies, race fantasies of what we're supposed to be that's constructed by the white mainstream media. So CKLN Radio and working in community media was very empowering, not just for me as an individual, but I felt for many collective communities who worked together, who met, and who shared stories and then told our stories from points of views. Can you all hear me? I'm not sure.
I think I do. Hold the microphone really close to your mouth.
I'll be eating the mic.
It should be.
Is this
And so I just want to continue about the kinds of realities that we see represented in the media. And we all know about these kinds of tokenized news programmings or disaster news. And then occasionally the cultural celebrations and our dances, costumes, and foods, they're all enjoyed. And there's this kind of like tourism by television of our culture. And that's what's acceptable, it's not threatening, it's not dangerous. And then there's the specialized times. There's African Liberation Month, there's Lesbian and Gay Pride Day, there's Asian History Month. So we're given these slotted moments of showing up and taking space. So at some point we've become so accustomed to TV and media being owned by private monopolies that I think in some part we've forgotten the public part of the airwaves. And this is what I'd like to focus my talk on, or the remainder of my talk, because I think it's really important that we start looking at how to take action and take control of media. And it's interesting that the other panelists here have spoken about that too. It seems really action-oriented, and I think we're prepped and we're ready for this kind of action. There's a public television movement that's been happening across North America. Local media activists have started to shoot, edit, and produce their own news and information programming. This hands-on programming has created a space on the channel for community-based information and perspectives to get out there, to be popularized and legitimized. And it's timely, technologically speaking, because never before have mini DVs, home editing software programs, good sound, cheap, durable sound kits, all these things are much more accessible than they ever have been before technologically. So in America, there's Paper Tiger Television. And they're a nonprofit, volunteer-driven video collective, and their mandate is to produce and distribute public access programming, media literacy video production workshops, community screenings, and do grassroots advocacy work to challenge and expose corporate control of mainstream media. Now, Paper Tiger Television was very active in Seattle when the whole globalization issue sort of broke open in mainstream media. For mainstream media, it was a surprise, but for people who are working in grassroots, community-driven media, they were quite ready for it, and they knew it was happening. And that's because they'd been organizing community media outlets, and they were connected. They were talking to each other and sharing stories. So Paper Tiger Television has become a bit of a giant in terms of community media in the States. And they broadcast on a number of community channels all across the United States. Now recently, I had the good fortune to meet Sid Tan, and he's a member of CCNC from Vancouver. And Sid is a longtime media activist, and he's part of a collective that's taken Rogers Cable TV in Vancouver to task. Rogers Cable Television gets funding from the federal government to program their community channel, and they are required by CRTC laws to have Cable 10, to give it to community for public access television. What happens with this channel in Toronto, I'm sure you've all seen it, it looks like sort of a cheap, low-rent grade version of mainstream corporate television. The kinds of messaging, the kinds of programming. They have TV personalities who are clearly aiming to be on mainstream television, or they have TV personalities who are has-beens from mainstream television. They don't reflect community programming or community realities or ideas. Now,
Minister, I'm going to give you 1 more minute.
Okay. So what Sid and other activists like him have done is they've joined together to form ICTV, which is Independent Community Television. And within basically 10 years, they've managed to secure 16 hours of community programming on the Rogers Cable Channel in Vancouver. They asked for it, and Rogers refused. They complained, they wrote letters to the CRTC, and they won, and they secured the 16 hours over a 10-year struggle. So right now they've got all kinds of current shows like East Side Story, which is a magazine show. It's focused from the east side of Vancouver. Or Saltwater City Television, which tells the stories of Chinese Canadians in Vancouver. So that's radical television to me, and it's ours, and we have a legitimate right to use it and exploit it. And it seems here in Toronto, we've kind of forgotten that it belongs to us because it's been normalized that it doesn't. So I think I just wanted to point that opportunity out as a means for us to take a hold of television and use it for our own discretion. And I just want to end with an idea that I often think about or remind myself about when I do the kind of politically engaged community media work that I do, which is power is never given, it's taken. And that's what this is about. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. I guess maybe I'll start off with just talking a little bit about the birth of the Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. I think it's maybe a case study in the kind of taking of power that Minsuk was just talking about. In 1997, I'm not sure if you guys remember, but that was the official year of the Canada Pacific. And there were federal funds floating around for special programming initiatives from the Asian community across Canada. And there were a couple of members of the Toronto Asian community who were involved in media arts in one form or another, who realized that there were a lot of, or there was sort of a critical mass of people behind the camera, directing, writing Asian Canadian film and video. And so essentially Anita Lee, who is a producer, and Andrew Sun, who was living in Toronto at the time and was a journalist with Now Magazine, and a number of other people got together and they applied for very minimal funding and volunteer their services and expertise and put this festival together in '97. And that was also the same year that the Vancouver Asian Film Festival started. So '97 was a little bit of a landmark year in terms of Asian film festivals here in Canada. Since then, Real Asian has grown. This is the 8th year that we're doing the festival. In the first year, they focused mainly on North American Asian film and video, but now we've grown and we're also showing stuff from Asian communities all over the world. So that includes not only Asia, but also Asians living in Europe or Australia, that kind of thing. I guess some of the things that I want to talk about, well, there are a number of things. I guess one thing is that whether the question of the festival's existence, some people, still wonder, well, is there a reason for an Asian festival? When you see a lot of, now there's so much cachet in Asian culture. Asian cinema has definitely arrived, but it seems like there's sort of these two concurrent streams going on where there are these images of Asians being presented in the mainstream media. Again, I mean, these are recurring themes. There's the mainstream version, and then there's, again and again, it's been repeated that it seems that independent or alternative media sources seem to be the place to go to see sort of more accurate representations of Asians in society. That is actually one point about Real Asian that I neglected to mention, was that the focus is on independent film and video. So we do show the odd mainstream film or video, but ironically we consider that to be our audience outreach, where we're trying to get mainstream audiences into our festival to see independent or more alternative stories created for, by, and about Asians. We get a lot of different kinds of submissions into the festival. We'll get stuff by Asians where I guess they're sort of cashing in, almost, it seems, on sort of the recent cachet that Asian culture has had, and you know, some of those filmmakers are visibly disappointed when their film doesn't get in, because they don't understand why, you know, I'm Asian, my film deals specifically with you know, Asian issues and that kind of thing. But then we also have films made by non-Asians, but that are that we feel would be of interest to Asian audiences that do get into the festival. So there's sort of multi-layered issues around the purpose of an Asian film festival. So there's the issue of presenting stories and images of Asians that are accurate or new or fresh representations. But there's also the issue of professional development and encouraging Asians who are or want to work in media arts to sort of either further develop their careers or give them what for many people really is their first opportunity to be featured at a film festival. I think there are a number of, I guess, things that happen when you see some of the films that are in the festival. One example that I don't know, Richard had mentioned earlier about just stereotypes and, you know, how tired a lot of these things are. And I thought of a few films that I had seen recently that kind of build on those stereotypes. And in fact, what was interesting about these films was they took those stereotypes and they acknowledged that, okay, the reason why these stereotypes come into play is because they are in some way based on fact. The film that I'm thinking of is something that I saw called Takeout, and it's the story of a Chinese restaurant delivery guy, recent immigrant, and so, you know, there's a stereotype right there, but then it tells his story and it follows him through a day of his deliveries and whatnot. And there was just a lot of incredible humanity behind his story, but it also had that kind of danger thing. What happens is he's got a debt that he's got to repay by the end of the day, and he has to make, you know, $100 in tips to pay off this debt, or he's in really big trouble. And it was just really well done, but again, it was something that was done on the fly, totally independent.